Behind one of the most famous structures ever built by human hands sits an almost unimaginable quantity of water, the largest reservoir in the entire United States, held in check by a single colossal wall of concrete wedged into a deep desert canyon. Hoover Dam is a monument to human engineering and ambition, and for generations it has faithfully held back the mighty waters of the Colorado River, storing them, controlling them, and delivering them to the vast region that depends on them to survive. But what would happen in the first 24 hours if that great wall failed and the immense volume of water it holds was suddenly and catastrophically released into the valley below? It is a question that is terrifying to contemplate, and yet exploring it reveals something important about the awesome forces held in check and the stakes involved in the great structure. What would that first day look like, hour by hour, as the flood surged down the river and the region confronted a catastrophe of enormous proportions? This is a walk through that first day, the first 24 hours after Hoover Dam fails, told hour by hour, a scenario of what those critical and terrible hours might hold as the flood traveled relentlessly downstream, and the region struggled to respond to a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. Before we go any further, it is essential to be honest and clear about something crucial. Hoover Dam is an extraordinarily robust and carefully engineered structure, one of the most massive and well-built dams in the world, monitored and maintained with the greatest care, and the catastrophic sudden failure of the dam is considered extremely unlikely. This is not a prediction that the dam will fail, nor a suggestion that its failure is imminent or probable. It is an exploration of a hypothetical scenario, a thought experiment, undertaken to understand the immense power held behind the dam and the geography of the river below, and to appreciate the importance of the engineering and the vigilance that keep the dam safe. With that important caveat firmly in mind, let us walk through the hypothetical first, 24 hours, hour by hour, to understand what such a day might hold. In this video, we are going to walk through those first 24 hours in sequence, from the instant of failure through the flood's long journey down the river valley. We are going to see how the initial surge would tear through the canyon nearest the dam, how the floodway would travel downstream hour by hour, and how it would reach the downstream reservoirs and threaten a cascading chain of failures. We are going to follow the race between the flood and the warning that would determine who could escape, the spreading of the catastrophe across a vast region over the course of the day, and the disruption of the whole system of water and power on which the region depends. And we are going to return, again and again, to the reassuring reality that the failure of Hoover Dam is considered extremely unlikely, and to the lessons that imagining the scenario can teach us about the power of the water and the importance of the dam's safety. Stay with us, because understanding the first 24 hours is a way of grasping both the awesome forces the dam holds in check and the remarkable engineering that keeps them safely contained. The disaster would begin in an instant. In the moment of failure, the Great Wall would give way, and the immense quantity of water held behind it would be released surging into the canyon below with a force almost beyond comprehension. The initial release would be catastrophic, a wall of water tearing through the canyon just below the dam, moving with tremendous speed and carrying enormous energy. In the first minutes, the areas immediately below the dam would be inundated, the surging water tearing through the canyon and sweeping away everything in its path. This initial surge, close to the dam, would be the most violent phase of the entire flood, the water at its most powerful and its most concentrated, and the areas nearest the dam would face the flood first and most severely, with essentially no warning whatsoever and no realistic chance of escape for anyone caught in the immediate path of the surging water as it tore through the canyon in those first terrible moments. It is worth pausing on just how little warning the areas closest to the dam would have, because it underscores the terrible speed of the disaster in its first phase. For the reaches immediately below the dam, the flood would arrive almost instantly, in the first minutes after the failure, far too fast for any warning to reach the people there or for them to escape. There would be no time to sound an alarm, no time to evacuate, no time to react, only the sudden arrival of the surge. This is the grim reality of the areas nearest the dam, that their proximity to the great structure, which in normal times is unremarkable, would in the scenario of a failure mean that they had essentially no chance, the flood arriving before any warning could possibly reach them. It is a sobering aspect of the first hour, the recognition that for those closest to the dam, the disaster would be upon them before they could even know it was coming. In the first hour after the failure, the flood would begin its journey down the river, surging downstream through the canyon country below the dam. The water, released all at once, would race down the river channel, following the course of the Colorado toward the south, and the flood wave would begin to travel down the valley. In this first hour, the areas closest to the dam, in the canyon reaches just below it, would be overwhelmed, and the flood would begin to move toward the next reaches downstream. The speed of the flood in this early phase would be tremendous, the water surging down the canyon with great force, and the first hour would see the beginning of the flood's journey, the leading edge of the surge racing downstream, while the areas nearest the dam were already inundated. It is worth understanding how the flood would behave in these early hours, because the physics of the surge would shape the entire disaster. A dam failure flood is not like an ordinary flood that rises gradually. It is a sudden release of an enormous volume of water all at once, which forms a surge, a wall of water that races downstream far faster and far higher than any normal river flow. In the narrow canyon reaches just below the dam, this surge would be at its most violent, the water confined and concentrated by the canyon walls, rising to tremendous heights and moving with devastating speed. As the surge traveled and the valley widened, it would spread out and lose some of its height and its speed, but it would still carry an immense volume of water, far more than the river channel could contain, spilling out across the floodplain wherever the valley allowed. The behavior of the surge, violent and concentrated near the dam and spreading as it traveled, would determine how the flood struck each community in its path, and it is the reason the areas nearest the dam would face the most extreme danger. There was a crucial element of timing that would govern the entire first day, because the flood would not reach all the communities at once, but would travel down the river over many hours. The leading edge of the surge would move downstream at a certain pace, reaching the nearest areas within minutes, and the more distant communities only after hours of travel down the valley. This means that the disaster would unfold as a wave moving down the river, striking each community in turn as the surge arrived, so that at any given moment during the first day, some areas would already be devastated, some would be in the midst of the flood, and some would still be bracing for its arrival. This traveling nature of the flood is what would give the more distant communities their only chance, the hours of warning as the flood made its way toward them. And it is what would make the race between the flood and the warning so critical to the outcome. As the first hours passed, the flood would continue its journey down the river, reaching the first of the downstream reservoirs and the communities along the river. Below Hoover Dam, the river flows through a series of reaches, and there are other reservoirs and dams downstream that the flood would reach as it traveled. The arrival of the enormous surge at the next reservoir downstream would have profound consequences, because the sudden influx of so much water could overwhelm that reservoir and threaten the dam that holds it back, raising the specter of a cascading failure. If the downstream dam were overwhelmed and failed as well, the flood would be augmented and would continue downstream with renewed force, threatening the communities further down the river. This cascading potential is one of the most alarming aspects of the scenario, the possibility that the failure of the Great Dam could set off a chain of failures down the river system, compounding the catastrophe. By a few hours after the failure, the flood would be well on its way down the river, and the first communities along the lower river would be facing the threat. The towns and communities that lie along the river below the dams, in the river valley through which the Colorado flows, would be in the path of the flood as it traveled downstream. The communities closest to the dams and the reservoirs would face the flood first, receiving the surge while it was still near its most violent, while the communities further downstream would have somewhat more time before the flood reached them. In these first hours, the leading communities along the river would be confronting the arrival of the flood, the surging water threatening their homes and their infrastructure, while the more distant communities would be bracing for the flood's arrival in the hours to come. The warning and the response would be racing against the flood in these critical early hours. For the communities closest to the dam, there would be essentially no warning, the flood arriving too fast for any meaningful response. But for the communities further downstream, there would be some time, the flood taking hours to travel down the river to reach them. And in that time, the warning systems and the emergency response would be working desperately to alert the population and to evacuate the areas in the path of the flood. The effectiveness of this response would depend on the systems in place to detect the failure and to warn the communities, and on the ability of the people to evacuate in the time available. In these early hours, the race between the flood and the warning would be underway, the outcome depending on how quickly the alert could reach the communities, and how fast they could move to safety. By around the 6th hour, the flood would have traveled a considerable distance down the river, well beyond the canyon reaches near the dam, and into the broader valley, and the scale of the catastrophe would be becoming clear to everyone watching it unfold. The areas near the dam would be devastated, the communities in the upper reaches of the river inundated, and the flood would be continuing its journey downstream, threatening the communities further down the valley. The response would be mobilizing, the emergency systems working to warn and evacuate the communities in the path. But the sheer scale of the disaster and the speed of the flood would be straining the response to its limits. By this point, the region would be confronting the reality of a major catastrophe, the flood having traveled far down the river and the destruction mounting, and the response would be racing to keep ahead of the flood and to protect the communities still in its path. The middle hours of the first day would see the flood continuing its progression down the lower river, reaching the communities in the middle and lower reaches of the valley. As the flood traveled downstream, it would spread and moderate somewhat from its initial violent surge, but it would still carry enormous destructive power, far beyond anything the river normally carries, and the communities in its path would face serious inundation. The towns and cities in the middle reaches of the lower river would confront the flood as it arrived, the surging water spreading across the floodplain, threatening the homes and the infrastructure and the people. The greater distance from the dam would provide more warning time for these communities, more opportunity to evacuate, but the flood would still pose a grave threat, and the middle hours of the day would see the disaster spreading down the length of the river valley. By around the 12th hour, halfway through the first day, the flood would have traveled far down the river, and the catastrophe would have spread across a wide region. The upper reaches near the dam would be devastated, the middle reaches inundated, and the flood would be continuing toward the lower reaches of the river. The response would be fully mobilized by this point, a massive emergency effort underway to warn and evacuate the communities, to rescue those in danger, and to cope with the enormous destruction. But the scale of the disaster would be overwhelming, the flood having affected a vast stretch of the river valley, the destruction immense, and the response strained to its limits. The 12th hour would mark the midpoint of the first day, a moment when the full scale of the catastrophe was becoming apparent, and the region was grappling with a disaster of enormous proportions. The consequences of the flood would extend far beyond the immediate inundation, because the failure of the dam would disrupt the entire system that depends on it. The water supply that the reservoir provides to millions of people would be thrown into chaos, the electricity generated at the dam would be lost, and the management of the river would be in disarray. The communities affected by the flood would be facing not just the inundation, but the loss of their water and power, and the disruption of every system they depend on. And the cascading threat to the downstream dams and reservoirs would compound the catastrophe, potentially disrupting the entire system that manages the Colorado River. By the middle of the first day, the region would be confronting not just a flood, but a comprehensive catastrophe, the failure of the dam having disrupted the whole interconnected system on which the region depends. It is worth reflecting on the experience of the communities further down the river during these middle hours, because their situation would be different from that of the areas near the dam. These more distant communities would receive warning of the disaster, the alert reaching them as the flood traveled toward them, giving them a window of time before the surge arrived. In that window, the scene would be one of urgent evacuation, the residents fleeing to higher ground and away from the river, the roads filling with those seeking to escape the coming flood, the emergency crews working to move people to safety. It would be a race against time, the communities emptying ahead of the advancing flood, the hours of warning being used to get as many people as possible out of the path of the water. For these communities, the outcome would depend on how well the warning worked, and how quickly the people could move, and the middle hours of the first day would be a time of desperate evacuation as the flood approached. As the afternoon and evening of the first day wore on, the flood would continue its progression toward the lower reaches of the river, and the communities in the lower valley would be confronting the threat. The flood, having traveled a great distance from the dam, would have spread and moderated, but it would still represent a massive surge of water, far exceeding the capacity of the river channel, and the communities in the lower reaches would face inundation as the flood arrived. These more distant communities would have had the most warning time, the flood taking many hours to reach them, and the evacuation efforts would have had the most time to work, potentially allowing many people to reach safety before the flood arrived. But the flood would still pose a grave threat, and the lower reaches of the river would face the disaster as the first day continued. By around the 18th hour, the flood would have reached deep into the lower river valley, and the catastrophe would have spread across an enormous region. The disaster would now encompass a vast stretch of the river, from the devastated reaches near the dam to the lower valley where the flood was still arriving, and the scale of the destruction would be staggering. The response would be struggling to cope with a catastrophe of this magnitude, the emergency systems overwhelmed by the scale and the extent of the disaster, working desperately to rescue those in danger and to aid the communities affected. By this point, the first day would be drawing toward its close, and the region would be confronting the full scale of one of the greatest disasters imaginable, a catastrophe that had spread across a wide region and affected a large population. The cascading threat that would unfold during the first day deserves closer attention because it is one of the most alarming dimensions of the scenario. Below Hoover Dam, the river passes through additional reservoirs held back by other dams, and as the flood surge reached each of these in turn, it would deliver a sudden and enormous influx of water far beyond what the reservoir was designed to hold. This could overwhelm the downstream dam, and if that dam were to fail under the onslaught, its own reservoir would be released, adding to the flood and sending it onward with renewed force. In this way, the failure of the great upstream dam could set off a chain reaction down the river, each dam potentially overwhelmed by the flood from the one above, the disaster compounding as it traveled. This cascading potential would make the first day even more catastrophic, because the flood would not simply diminish as it traveled, but could be renewed and augmented at each downstream reservoir, spreading the destruction further and making the catastrophe even greater than the release of a single reservoir alone. The disruption to the emergency response itself would be one of the great challenges of the first day, because the same flood that created the need for a response would also cripple the ability to respond. The floodwaters would wash out roads and bridges, cutting off the routes that emergency crews would need to reach the affected areas and that residents would need to evacuate. The loss of power from the dam and the damage to the electrical and communication systems would hamper the coordination of the response and the ability to warn and inform the population. The sheer scale of the disaster, spread across a vast region, would overwhelm the emergency resources available, forcing difficult choices about where to concentrate the response. Throughout the first day, the response would be struggling not only against the flood itself, but against the way the flood undermined the very systems and routes on which the response depended. A challenge that would make the effort to save lives and aid the communities all the harder. The human toll of the disaster, by this point in the first day, could be immense, depending on how effective the warning and the evacuation had been. For the communities closest to the dam, which had little or no warning, the toll could be severe, the people caught by the flood with no chance to escape. For the communities further downstream, which had more warning, the toll would depend on how many had been able to evacuate in the time available, and effective warning and evacuation could have saved many lives. But even with the best response, the scale of the disaster would likely mean a significant loss of life, along with the destruction of homes and communities and infrastructure across a wide region. By the 18th hour, the human dimension of the catastrophe would be becoming clear. A toll measured in lives lost and communities destroyed across the length of the river valley. As the first day approached its final hours, the flood would be reaching the lowest reaches of the river, and the catastrophe would be nearing its full extent. The flood wave, having traveled the length of the lower river over the course of the day, would be reaching the areas closest to the lower course of the Colorado, the final communities in its path. By this point, the flood would have spread and moderated considerably from its initial violent surge, but it would still represent a major flood, and the communities in the lowest reaches would face inundation as the flood arrived. The response, having worked throughout the day, would be reaching these final communities, the warning and the evacuation efforts having had the most time to work, but the flood would still pose a threat as the first day drew toward its close. By the 24th hour, the end of the first full day, the flood would have traveled nearly the entire length of the lower river, and the catastrophe would have spread across its full extent, a disaster of a scale that would rank among the greatest the region had ever known. The disaster would now encompass the entire lower river valley, from the devastated reaches near the dam to the lowest reaches where the flood was still arriving. A swath of destruction extending across a vast region and affecting an enormous population. The response would be fully engaged, a massive emergency effort struggling to cope with a catastrophe of unprecedented scale, working to rescue those in danger to aid the communities affected, and to begin to grapple with the immense destruction. The end of the first day would mark the point at which the flood had spread across its full extent, the catastrophe having reached its greatest geographic scope, and the region confronting the full reality of one of the greatest disasters imaginable. But the end of the first 24 hours would not be the end of the disaster, only the end of its first and most acute phase. The flood would eventually recede as the released water drained away and the surge dissipated, but the aftermath would be enormous. The region left with the task of coping with the destruction, of rescuing the survivors, of restoring the systems that had been disrupted, and of beginning the long and difficult work of recovery. The first 24 hours would be the phase in which the flood traveled and the destruction spread. But the days and weeks and months that followed would be consumed by the aftermath, the response and the recovery from a catastrophe of enormous proportions. The end of the first day would mark the transition from the acute phase of the flood to the long aftermath, a transition from the immediate disaster to the prolonged struggle to recover from it. This hour-by-hour walk through the first 24 hours reveals the enormous scale and the terrible power of what a failure of Hoover Dam would represent, the way that the release of the Great Reservoir would send a flood down the length of the lower river, spreading destruction across a wide region and affecting an enormous population over the course of a single day. It reveals the geography of the disaster, the way the flood would travel down the river, threatening first the areas near the dam and then the communities down the valley in sequence, and the race between the flood and the warning that would determine the toll. And it reveals the interconnected nature of the catastrophe, the way the failure of the dam would disrupt not just the river, but the whole system of water and power and infrastructure on which the region depends. Understanding the first 24 hours is a way of grasping the full stakes of the scenario, the magnitude of what the Great Dam holds back, and the catastrophe that its failure would unleash. This brings us back to the reassuring reality that must be emphasized, which is that the catastrophic failure of Hoover Dam is considered extremely unlikely. The dam is a massive and robust structure, built to an extraordinary standard, monitored and maintained with great care. And the scenario we have walked through is a hypothetical, one, a thought experiment, not a prediction of an event that is expected to occur. The engineers who designed the dam accounted for the enormous forces it must withstand, and the structure has proven its durability over a long span of time. It is important to hold both truths together, the awesome potential danger represented by the immense reservoir, and the reassuring reality that the dam is very unlikely to fail. The walk through the first 24 hours is valuable for understanding the stakes, but it should not be a source of undue fear, because the dam is, by design and by careful maintenance, a very safe structure. Still, the exercise of walking through the first 24 hours serves an important purpose, because it reveals the immense responsibility that comes with holding back so much water, and the importance of the ongoing care and vigilance that keep the dam safe. A structure that holds back so vast a reservoir, poised above the communities of the lower river valley, carries an enormous responsibility, and the safety of the millions downstream depends on the continued integrity of the dam and the diligence of those who monitor and maintain it. The walk through the disaster underscores why that vigilance is so important, why the resources devoted to the safety of the dam are so well spent, and why the ongoing monitoring and maintenance must never be neglected. The very fact that the first 24 hours would be so catastrophic is the reason that so much care is taken to ensure the failure never happens. The scenario also underscores the value of preparedness and of the warning systems that would be so crucial in the event of a failure, however unlikely. The race between the flood and the warning that would unfold in the first 24 hours highlights the importance of the systems that would detect a failure and alert the communities downstream, giving them the precious time they would need to evacuate. For the communities in the path of a potential flood, being aware of the danger, however remote, and having plans and routes for evacuation is a wise precaution, part of the broader emergency preparedness that even the most unlikely disasters warrant. The walk through the first 24 hours is a reminder of the value of this preparedness, of the systems and the plans that would be the difference between a manageable evacuation and a mass casualty disaster in the event of a failure. In the end, the walk through the first 24 hours after Hoover Dam fails is a way of understanding the immense power held behind the Great Dam and the catastrophe that its failure would unleash, a scenario that reveals the scale and the stakes of what the dam holds back. Hour by hour, the flood would travel down the river, spreading destruction across a wide region and affecting an enormous population, a catastrophe of a magnitude that is difficult to comprehend. But it is essential to remember that this is a hypothetical, an exploration of a scenario that is extremely unlikely to occur, undertaken to understand the power of the reservoir and the importance of the dam's safety, not to predict a disaster. Hoover Dam is a robust and carefully maintained structure, and its failure is considered highly improbable. A scenario that the engineering and the vigilance of those who built and maintained the dam have worked to ensure remains forever in the realm of the hypothetical. And so as we contemplate the walk through the first 24 hours, we should come away not with fear, but with a deeper appreciation for the engineering that holds the water safely in check, for the vigilance that keeps the dam sound, and for the immense power of the river that the dam controls. The hour-by-hour journey of the flood is a reminder of the stakes, of what is held back by the dam, and what depends on its integrity. But it is also a reminder of the value of the careful work that keeps the dam safe and the communities of the lower river valley secure. The failure of Hoover Dam is a scenario worth understanding, but it is one that the diligence and the engineering of those who built and maintained the dam have worked to ensure remains a thought experiment rather than a reality. The dam stands, the water is held, and the communities below live in safety. And that is a testament to the human capacity to control the mighty forces of nature, and to hold back safely and enduringly the immense reservoir whose sudden release we have imagined our